The Predecessor Script had been sitting in the Grand Linguistics Institute's vault for 73 years, mocking everyone who looked at it. Not metaphorically mocking them, mind you, though that would have been easier to deal with. No, the thing seemed to possess an actual malevolent sentience, as if the ancient civilization that wrote it had specifically designed these symbols to make future scholars weep into their translation matrices. The institute itself was a marvel of architectural excess, floating above the methane clouds of Velshar Prime like someone's idea of what intelligence should look like if it were a building. Crystalline towers spiraled upward in mathematically perfect helixes, and every surface gleamed with that particular sheen that screamed, "We spent more money on this than your planet's GDP." Inside, the greatest minds from 400 species gathered to do what academics do best: argue about things no one else cared about, and drink stimulants that would kill lesser beings. Director Kalvek stood before the assembled committee in the obsidian conference chamber, all 6 of his insectoid eyes blinking in a pattern that his species used to convey profound irritation. His exoskeleton had been polished to a mirror sheen for this meeting, because apparently, even when discussing your most embarrassing professional failure, one had to look presentable. "Colleagues," he began, mandibles clicking with barely suppressed frustration, "we have exhausted every methodological approach known to galactic science. The Predecessor Script remains, as it has for 7 decades, completely and utterly incomprehensible." Professor Flynn, a methodical being whose 4 arms were currently holding 4 different data tablets, made a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Perhaps incomprehensible is too strong a word, Director. We have identified 17 distinct symbol clusters, mapped their frequency distribution, and established that the text follows a linear reading pattern. We simply cannot determine what any of it means." "That," announced Dr. Wixhall from her crystalline support cradle, her voice resonating through the chamber like a singing bowl, "is the very definition of incomprehensible, Thren." The Predecessor Script had become something of a legend in academic circles, the kind of puzzle that destroyed careers and created bitter rivalries. The civilization that created it had vanished approximately 30,000 years ago, leaving behind exactly 17 documents written in this infuriating writing system, several architectural wonders that defied physics, and absolutely no instruction manual for any of it. Every major academic institution in the galaxy had taken a crack at it. The Crethaxians, who could calculate pi to the millionth digit in their heads while asleep, had approached it as pure mathematics. They spent 8 years developing elaborate formulas, created a 3-dimensional model of symbol relationships that required a small moon to process, and ultimately concluded that either the script was random noise or mathematics itself was a lie. Their lead researcher had retired to become a botanical artist, which told you everything about how well that went. The Velshurans, blessed with limited telepathic abilities and an insufferable tendency to mention this in every conversation, had tried commune directly with the essence of the text. This resulted in 47 scholars simultaneously developing migraines that lasted 6 months, and a strongly worded letter from the Galactic Medical Board about irresponsible use of psychic abilities in academic settings. The Ixthari had employed quantum probability matrices, theorizing that the script existed in a superposition of meanings that would collapse into sense once properly observed. Instead, their observations caused the opposite effect. The more they looked, the less sense anything made. One researcher claimed the symbols had started rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking, but since he was also sleeping 4 hours a week at that point, nobody took him seriously. Director Kalvex clicked through a holographic display showing decades of failure, each slide a monument to galactic hubris. "The governing board has made their position clear. If we cannot produce results within the next lunar cycle, our funding will be redirected to the Department of Practical Linguistics, who wish to study what they call languages that actual people actually speak." He made this sound like the greatest insult imaginable. "So we're desperate," stated Wicks Hall, her crystalline structure refracting the holographic light into rainbow patterns across the walls. We prefer the term exploring unconventional methodologies, Calvex corrected, though his mandibles twitched in a way that suggested he knew exactly how thin that euphemism was. Thren's wind chime voice took on a hesitant quality. About these unconventional methodologies, the proposal from Sector 447, the human. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, which was impressive considering it was climate-controlled to within 1 degrees. Humans had joined the galactic community approximately 40 years ago, and the general consensus was that this had been a mistake, though nobody could quite agree on whose mistake specifically. They were barely post-nuclear, still figuring out faster-than-light travel, and had an unsettling tendency to pack bond with anything that moved, and several things that didn't. Their academic credentials were, charitably speaking, adorable. They had universities older than some species' first written languages, which sounded impressive until you realized those universities were still teaching from physical books like some kind of Bronze Age civilization. His credentials are technically adequate, Calvex admitted, the way one might admit that a certain food is technically edible. Dr. Marcus Flynn, specialist in xenolinguistics, though I use the term specialist loosely. His publication record includes papers on human historical languages, which is rather like being an expert in different types of primitive stick scratching. The board approved this? Wixhal's crystalline form actually darkened, which was her species' equivalent of raising an eyebrow. The board, Calvex said with the tone of someone quoting particularly stupid legislation, has mandated that we explore all available expertise, regardless of origin species. Apparently, there was a subcommittee meeting about diversity of perspectives. It got very philosophical. There were interpretive presentations. The other committee members made various sounds of sympathy. Everyone had suffered through mandatory diversity training. "When does he arrive?" asked Thren. As if on cue, the chamber doors opened with a pneumatic hiss that was calibrated to sound important. What walked through was decidedly underwhelming. Dr. Marcus Flynn stood roughly 1.8 meters tall, which was average for a human and short for most galactic species represented in the room. He wore what humans called a suit, though it was wrinkled in a way that suggested it had been packed in a bag and forgotten about. His hair was doing something chaotic that defied several laws of physics and possibly good taste. He carried a single battered case that looked older than some interstellar treaties. "Morning," he said, which was incorrect because by the station's timekeeping, it was evening. "Sorry about the delay. Your security scanners had a philosophical breakdown trying to categorize my luggage." Calvex's mandibles worked silently for a moment. "Dr. Flynn, welcome to the Grand Linguistics Institute. I am Director Calvex, and these are—" "Yeah, got the briefing packet on the shuttle. Look, no offense, but can we skip the formal introductions? I've been traveling for 3 weeks. I'm running on coffee that technically qualifies as a chemical weapon, and I'd really like to see this impossible script before I collapse." The committee members exchanged glances, which was complicated given that some of them didn't have eyes in the traditional sense. "Very well," Calvex said, his voice arctic. "Though I should warn you, Dr. Flynn, that you are looking at a puzzle that has defeated the finest linguistic minds in the galaxy." "Yeah, that's what makes it interesting," Marcus said, following Calvex toward the vault. "If it was easy, you wouldn't need the primitive stick scratcher, would you?" The vault containing the Predecessor Script was located in the Institute's deepest level, protected by enough security to make a paranoid dictator feel inadequate. Retinal scanners, DNA verification, quantum encryption keys, and, inexplicably, a traditional lock that required a physical key because someone on the security committee had read a human spy novel and thought it was a technical manual. The original documents were kept in stasis fields, perfectly preserved, their strange symbols seeming to shimmer in the controlled lighting. 17 documents, ranging from what looked like a single-page note to a tome that probably required its own furniture. The symbols were elegant, flowing things that curved and intersected in ways that seemed almost organic. Marcus approached the nearest document, a mid-sized text that the Institute had designated Primary Sample 7, and stared at it, just stared, for approximately 5 minutes of increasingly awkward silence. "Well?" Colvex finally asked. "Give me a second, I'm looking." "You've been looking." "Yeah, and now I'm continuing to look. It's this whole process, very advanced. You might have heard of it." Thren's forearms twitched in what might have been amusement. "Do you see something, Dr. Flynn?" "I see a whole lot of squiggles that someone took a lot of time to make pretty. Can I ask some questions?" "Of course," Calvex said, though his tone suggested he expected those questions to be stupid. "These documents, they're all the same age, right? Same civilization, same time period?" "Correct. Carbon dating and quantum decay analysis place them all within a 50-year window, approximately 30,000 years ago. And they were found in different locations. 3 different archaeological sites across 2 star systems." Marcus nodded, walking slowly along the row of stasis fields, examining each document. Different sizes, different lengths. This one looks important, fancy border, centered text, lots of space. This one's cramped, squeezed onto the page like they ran out of room. This one has what look like corrections. See these darker marks? "We cataloged all of those variations," Wixhall said. "They provide no insight into the meaning of the symbols." "Sure, but they provide insight into the people writing them. Where were these found specifically? What kind of buildings?" Thren consulted one of his tablets. "Primary samples 1 through 4 were recovered from what appeared to be an administrative complex. 5 and 6 from a structure we believe was educational. 7 through 17 from what archaeological evidence suggests was either a library or archive facility. So official stuff, teaching stuff, and stored knowledge stuff. That is an extremely reductive but essentially accurate summary, yes." Marcus reached the end of the row, turned around and walked back, hands shoved in his pockets. "Okay, here's a weird question. Do any of you have examples of informal writing from the predecessors? Personal letters, shopping lists, graffiti, anything like that?" The committee members looked at each other with the universal expression of beings who had never considered something that now seemed obvious. "The archaeological sites were all institutional in nature," Colvex said slowly. "We have recovered no personal artifacts with writing." "Right, so everything you have is formal documentation. Official records, educational, texts, archived knowledge." Marcus stopped in front of Primary Sample 7 again. "Can I see high-resolution scans, like really high resolution, where I can see the individual stroke patterns?" "What possible relevance could stroke patterns have?" Wixhall asked, though she was already pulling up the requested files on a holographic display. "Humor me. I'm the primitive stick scratcher, remember?" The hologram expanded to show a single symbol magnified to the size of a small vehicle. At this resolution, you could see the texture of whatever medium the predecessors had used, the tiny variations in thickness where the writing implement had pressed harder or softer. Marcus leaned in close, examining it with an intensity that seemed at odds with his rumpled appearance. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me. You've discovered something?" Colvex moved closer, his antennae quivering with sudden interest. "Maybe, probably. Yeah, actually, definitely." Marcus turned to face the committee, and his expression was caught between amusement and disbelief. "Can I get a few things? I need paper, several different writing implements, and maybe a tablet if you've got one that does stylus input." "Paper?" Thren repeated the word as if Marcus had requested a live dinosaur. "Yeah, you know, processed plant fibers arranged in sheets, ancient human technology, revolutionary stuff." "We're aware of what paper is, Dr. Flynn. We're questioning why you need it." For a demonstration. Also, I'm going to need you all to not lose your minds when I explain this, because honestly, it's going to be embarrassing for everyone involved. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood at the head of the conference table with a stack of actual paper that a bemused intern had located in some storage facility, probably next to other obsolete items like fax machines, and hopes for a quick resolution to this problem. He had 3 different pens, 2 styluses, and the complete attention of beings who were beginning to suspect they'd either made a breakthrough or hired a madman, possibly both. Right, Marcus said, picking up a pen. Pop quiz. How many of you have handwriting? Silence. Okay, let me rephrase. How many of your species use writing implements that require individual manual control to form symbols? Wixhal's crystalline form pulsed. The Ixthari use direct neural interface for all written communication. Our thoughts are transmitted directly into standardized digital formats. Carthaxians employ mathematical matrices that are universal regardless of output method, added another committee member. Thren held up his 4 arms. The Velsharans use vocalization to text conversion. Our language is tonal, and our writing reflects precise phonetic transcription. And your species, Director? Calvex's mandibles clicked. The Chixtar use chemical secretion to create perfectly uniform symbols. Individual variation is physiologically impossible. Marcus grinned, and it was not a nice grin. It
was the grin of someone about to ruin everyone's day. So none of you have ever experienced the joyful nightmare that is handwriting. None of you have ever had to manually form letters, develop a personal style, or deal with the fact that the same symbol can look completely different depending on who's writing it, how fast they're writing, what they're writing with, and what context they're writing in. He picked up a pen and wrote on the paper in clear, blocky letters, "The Predecessor Script." Then, directly below it, he wrote the same words in rapid cursive, the letters flowing together, then again in all capitals with elaborate serifs, then in a cramped, hurried scrawl. "These all say the same thing," he said. "But if you'd never seen human writing before, if you had no concept of personal handwriting styles, if you approached this as pure symbolic logic, you'd think these were 4 completely different writing systems." The silence in the room was profound. "You're suggesting," Kolovex said slowly, "that the predecessor script is difficult to translate because it's written in different handwriting styles. Not just different styles, formal versus informal presentation. Look at this symbol here." Marcus pulled up the hologram of primary sample 7 again, pointing to a specific character. See how it's got these elaborate flourishes, these extended curves? Now look at this symbol in primary sample 12. The comparison appeared on the hologram. The same basic structure, but simplified, more compressed, with the decorative elements reduced or absent. Different fonts, Marcus said, or more accurately, the difference between calligraphy and everyday writing. The predecessors, like humans, apparently had formal writing for official documents and simpler writing for practical use, except you've only got the formal stuff, which is like trying to learn English exclusively from medieval illuminated manuscripts. Thren's 4 arms had gone completely still, all tablets forgotten. You're saying that 73 years of analysis failed because we didn't account for aesthetic variation in symbol presentation? Aesthetic variation that carries meaning, yeah, watch. Marcus wrote the word love in plain text, then wrote it again with elaborate decorative elements. Both of these say love, but the fancy one is communicating something extra, importance, formality, care in presentation. The predecessors weren't just writing, they were writing pretty, and you've been treating the prettiness as part of the core symbology instead of decoration. Dr. Wixhal's crystalline structure had gone completely dark, which was either deep thought or the equivalent of a system crash. The mathematical models assumed every variation in symbol structure was semantically significant. Right. So you were treating every decorative flourish as a different phoneme or concept, which made the whole thing unsolvable.
It'd be like if I showed you two fonts of the same English text and you tried to figure out why this language needed two completely different alphabets for the same sounds. Marcus walked back to the holographic displays, pulling up multiple samples. Look, here's primary sample 1 found in an administrative building. Every symbol is elaborate, carefully formed, lots of embellishment. This is formal writing, probably official documentation. Now look at primary sample 15 from the archive facility. Same basic symbols but simpler, more standardized. This is practical writing, meant for information storage and retrieval, not presentation. He zoomed in on specific symbols, showing the comparisons. Once you strip away the decorative elements and focus on the core structural components, the symbol set shrinks by about 60%. It's not a massive, complicated writing system. It's a moderate writing system with fancy and plain versions. But we performed frequency analysis, protested a Chickstar researcher whose name Marcus hadn't caught. Distribution patterns, contextual relationship mapping. On data sets where the same word looked different based on handwriting style and formality level. Your frequency analysis was treating dog, written plainly, and dog, written in calligraphy as different words. Of course, nothing made sense. The committee sat in stunned silence, which Marcus had to admit was pretty satisfying. He'd been in academia long enough to recognize the specific horror of realizing you'd spent decades overthinking something simple. Kulvex finally spoke, his voice very quiet. Can you translate it? The actual language? No idea. Don't know the grammar, don't know the vocabulary, don't know the syntax, but I can tell you which symbols are the same despite looking different, which ones are decorative flourishes versus core components, and which documents are formal versus informal. That should make your computational linguistics actually work, since you'll be working with the real symbol set instead of the fancy version. How long, asked Thren, would it take you to map these correlations? Marcus looked at the 17 documents, did some mental math, and shrugged. Give me a week, maybe 2. I'll need good scanning equipment, some reference materials on human paleography and typography, and probably more of that terrible coffee. We have resources beyond what you can possibly imagine, Kulvex said. Great. I'll also need someone to check if the predecessors had an equivalent to Comic Sans, because if they did, and if any of these documents are written in it, I'm quitting immediately. Over the next 10 days, Marcus worked with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. He set up shop in a laboratory space that had been designed for beings with 6 hands and somehow made it work. The walls became covered with printouts, in the Grand Linguistics Institute, showing symbol comparisons, variation patterns, and what he called font families. He recruited 3 junior researchers who were young enough to think this was cool rather than humiliating and taught them the basics of human paleography. They learned about serifs and sans serifs, about flourishes and ligatures, about the difference between a scribe trying to be fancy and a scribe trying to finish before lunch. The breakthrough came on day 8, when Marcus finally had enough data to run it through the Institute's translation matrices. He'd mapped approximately 400 distinct symbols down to their core forms, eliminating decorative variations, stylistic flourishes, and what he termed unnecessary curlicues that made everything confusing. When the computational linguistics program finally had clean data to work with, it took approximately 40 minutes to crack the basic grammar structure. Primary sample 7, it turned out, was a property deed. The elaborate, carefully formed symbols that had mystified galactic academics for 7 decades were describing who owned what parcel of land and the terms of its sale. It was basically an alien mortgage document. Primary sample 12, with its simpler styling, was an inventory list for a warehouse. The grand, mysterious Predecessor Script, the puzzle that had destroyed careers and consumed resources and driven people to drink fermented beverages not meant for their biology, was documenting the most mundane aspects of civilization. Property transfers, tax records, library catalogs, Shopping lists would have been more exciting. When Marcus presented his findings to the full committee, the silence was deafening. 73 years, Wixhall finally said, her voice very small for a being made of resonating crystal. 73 years, and it was handwriting. Fancy handwriting, Marcus corrected. Which is worse, honestly. It's like if someone in the future tried to decode English, but only had wedding invitations and legal documents written in elaborate calligraphy. They'd think we had the most complicated writing system ever, when really we just like to make things pretty sometimes. Director Colvex had been very quiet throughout the presentation. His exoskeleton seemed to have lost some of its polish. Dr. Flynn, he said carefully, how many other supposedly untranslatable scripts in the galactic archives might suffer from this same issue? Marcus had been thinking about that. Well, how many of them come from species that used manual writing implements and had concepts of formal versus informal presentation? Thren consulted his tablets, all 4 of them simultaneously. Approximately 47 documented cases of untranslatable or partially translated ancient scripts. Yeah, you're going to want to get some human paleographers to look at those, like all of them, immediately. The implications began sinking in. Decades of work, entire academic careers built on studying these impossible puzzles, research grants the size of planetary budgets, and the solution had
been sitting in human graduate programs under the heading Introduction to Historical Document Analysis. This is going to be embarrassing, Colvex said. Oh, monumentally, Marcus agreed cheerfully. I mean, you're going to have to explain that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, with your neural interfaces and quantum computers and telepathic abilities, got stumped by the concept of cursive writing. That's going to make the academic journals, probably the regular news too. Could we possibly, suggested one of the Carthaxian researchers hopefully, describe it as a unique insight into species-specific cognitive approaches rather than a fundamental oversight? You can describe it however you want, Marcus said, but people are going to call it the font incident, and you know it. They did know it. The truth was already spreading through the Institute's communication channels. Within hours, it would reach other academic institutions. Within days, the entire galactic community would know. The memes would be spectacular. There is, Colvex said with the air of someone trying to salvage something from a disaster, significant academic value in your methodology, the application of species-specific analytical frameworks to alien texts. We should publish jointly, establish proper protocols, perhaps form an interdisciplinary committee on. You want to make sure humans get credit so this doesn't look like you just missed something obvious, Marcus interrupted. That is an extremely cynical interpretation of, yes, exactly that. Marcus laughed, the sound echoing in the obsidian chamber. Fair enough, I'll co-author, but I get to write the abstract, and I'm absolutely including the phrase, decorative flourishes previously misidentified as semantically significant linguistic elements. That's the technical way of saying we mistook handwriting for alphabet, isn't it? It really is. The next few weeks were chaos. The Institute's translation of the predecessor texts revealed a civilization that was, frankly, kind of boring. They worried about taxes. They kept detailed records of who borrowed what from the library. They had property disputes and trade regulations, and one very long document that appeared to be someone complaining about their neighbor's fence. Other institutions began quietly requesting human consultants to review their impossible texts. The requests were phrased very diplomatically, with lots of language about fresh perspectives and innovative methodologies, but everyone knew what they really meant. Please check if we also got confused by handwriting.
3 of the 47 previously untranslatable scripts turned out to have the exact same issue. Another 12 had related problems involving artistic stylization, regional variations, or the alien equivalent of abbreviations. The galactic academic community was having what humans would call an existential crisis, and what the Chickasaw were calling a thorough reassessment of methodological assumptions. Marcus became accidentally famous, which he handled by continuing to dress like he'd been shot out of a cannon and maintaining a complete lack of respect for academic protocol. He gave lectures where he used phrases like, "You overthought it," and "Sometimes a squiggle is just a squiggle." Senior researchers found this either refreshing or infuriating, with very little middle ground. The final insult came when his team finished translating all 17 predecessor documents and discovered that one of them, Primary Sample 9, was essentially an ancient style guide. It included examples of proper formal writing, common informal shortcuts, and decorative elements appropriate for different contexts. It was literally an instruction manual for how to write pretty, and it had been sitting in the vault the entire time. When Marcus showed this to Director Colvex, the director's mandibles didn't move for a full minute. "In our defense," he finally said, "we didn't know it was a style guide because we couldn't read it." "Yeah, but you could have guessed based on the format. Look, it's got examples and variations all laid out systematically. Even without translation, this screams instructional document." "Dr. Flynn, you're not making this better." "I'm not trying to. I'm just saying, 73 years is a long time to not notice that one of your texts is formatted like a textbook." 6 months after Marcus's initial breakthrough, the galactic linguistics community held a major conference on what was being carefully termed the integration of species-specific cognitive frameworks in xenolinguistic analysis, which absolutely everyone except the people running it was calling the Font Conference. Marcus gave the keynote speech, which he titled, "Sometimes You Just Need to Check If It's Cursive, A Human Approach to Overthought Problems." The auditorium was packed. Half the audience was there to learn, the other half to see if he'd actually have the audacity to mock the entire galactic academic establishment to their faces. He did. "The thing about humans," he said, standing at a podium designed for beings twice his size, "is that we spent thousands of years writing things down by hand. We developed scripts that flowed, that varied, that looked different depending on who was writing and why and how much of a hurry they were in. Every human learns, usually around age 6, that the same letter can look completely different in different contexts. We think this is normal." He pulled up a hologram showing the same English sentence written in 10 different styles. "You guys, meanwhile, went straight to perfect standardized output. Neural interfaces, chemical secretions, whatever. You never had that messy phase where writing looked different based on individual variation. So when you encountered a species that did, you didn't have the framework to recognize it." A Carthaxian researcher raised a crystalline appendage. "Are you suggesting that human cognitive development, specifically the retention of manual writing skills, provides a unique advantage in certain analytical contexts?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes being a little bit primitive means you understand things the advanced folks miss. You optimize writing out of existence. We kept it because we're too stubborn to let go of pens and paper, and also because fountain pens are cool and nobody can tell me otherwise." This is hardly a rigorous academic. Yeah, it's not. But I'm right, and you know it. Sometimes the low-tech approach is the right approach. Sometimes you need someone who understands that people make things pretty just because, and that prettiness can mask the underlying structure. After his speech, Marcus was approached by representatives from a dozen different academic institutions, all of whom wanted to hire human consultants, establish exchange programs, or at least get his advice on their particular impossible puzzles. He turned most of them down, except for one that caught his interest. The Velsharan archive had a complete library of texts from an extinct civilization, all of which were technically readable but contextually nonsensical. Let me guess, Marcus said. You can parse the symbols, but the content seems random. Precisely. It's as if they're describing ordinary objects and activities, but in combinations that make no logical sense. Marcus grinned. Could be idioms, metaphors, sarcasm, if you're really unlucky. Humans use language figuratively all the time, and it makes perfect sense to us but sounds insane if you're reading it literally. The Velsharan representative's photosensitive organs dimmed in what might have been horror. You mean to suggest that an entire species might communicate extensively in non-literal frameworks? Oh, buddy, you have no idea. Wait until you learn about puns. Before leaving the conference, Marcus had one final meeting with Director Kalvex. The director had aged noticeably over the past months, though whether that was from stress or just the natural progression of time was unclear. Dr. Flynn, Kalvex said, I wanted to thank you personally. Despite the embarrassment, you've revolutionized our field. I drew some circles around the curly bits and told you to ignore them. I'm not sure that counts as revolutionary. You provided a perspective we lacked. That is the essence of advancement. Marcus considered this. You know what the real lesson is here? It's not about handwriting or fonts or any of that technical stuff. It's that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem is impossible because you're asking the wrong question. We asked how to translate the script. Right, but you should have been asking why it looked so complicated in the first place. The complexity was the clue, not the puzzle. The predecessors weren't being cryptic, they were just being fancy. Kalvex's mandibles clicked in a pattern that Marcus had
Learned meant amusement. I suppose expecting ancient civilizations to be mysterious is a form of academic bias. Oh, massively. Everyone wants to believe that ancient people were doing something profound and mystical. Sometimes they were just arguing about property lines and writing shopping lists with unnecessary flourishes because it looked nice. You've made us all feel rather foolish, you know. Yeah, but in a useful way. You'll think twice before assuming something is complicated next time. Or we'll just hire more humans and let you solve these problems. Marcus laughed. That's probably easier. We've got whole universities full of people who spent years learning to read terrible handwriting from dead languages. Turns out that's a marketable skill in the galactic community. As he left the institute for the last time, his battered case in hand and his suit still somehow wrinkled, despite having been cleaned by devices that could manipulate matter at the molecular level, Marcus felt pretty good about the whole experience. He'd solved an impossible puzzle, disrupted an entire academic field, and proven that sometimes humanity's refusal to fully optimize everything had unexpected benefits. He paused at the institute's entrance, looking back at the crystalline towers spiraling upward in their mathematically perfect helixes. Somewhere in there, the finest minds in the galaxy were probably still processing the fact that they'd been defeated by cursive writing. His communication device chimed. Another university, this one asking if he could take a look at what they described as a possibly encrypted text that exhibits unusual symbolic density. Marcus opened the file they'd sent, looked at the sample, recognized it immediately. He sent back a message. That's not encrypted. Someone just had really bad handwriting. Give me a month and I'll sort it out. The response came quickly. How can you possibly know that from a brief examination? Marcus typed back. Because I'm human, and we invented bad handwriting. It's basically our superpower. He closed the communication and headed for the shuttle bay, already composing in his head the paper he'd write about this. Maybe he'd call it On the Necessity of Preserving Inefficient Technologies, a defense of handwriting in the digital age. Or maybe just Why Pens Matter, an argument for being slightly primitive. Either way, it was going to drive the academic establishment absolutely crazy, which was half the fun. Behind him, in the Obsidian conference chamber, the committee was already compiling a list of other impossible problems they might want to run past someone with a human perspective. The Carthaxian mathematical approach had failed. The Velsharan telepathic communion had failed,
The Ixthari quantum probability matrices had failed. Maybe it was time to try asking someone whose species still used paper. The galactic academic community, for all its advancement and sophistication, was learning all.
Valuable lesson. Sometimes the beings with the most impressive technology aren't the ones with the most useful skills. Sometimes you need someone who understands that knowledge isn't just about perfect digital archives and neural interfaces. Sometimes you need someone who knows that writing can be messy and variable and still meaningful. Sometimes you need someone who can look at an elaborate,
Decorated, impossible to decipher text and think, that's pretty. Wonder what it says underneath all the fancy bits. And sometimes, just sometimes, that perspective is worth more than all the quantum computers in the galaxy. The Predecessor Script had been sitting in the vault for 73 years, mocking everyone who looked at it. Now it was translated, its mysteries revealed to be the mundane concerns of ordinary people who just happened to like making their writing pretty. The script wasn't mocking anyone anymore, but somewhere, Marcus liked to think, the predecessors were having a good laugh at the fact that it took the galaxy 30,000 years to realize they'd just been using their fancy handwriting.